Talking Radio.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Talking Radio, our conversations with the leading lights of the UK radio industry. Today, very excited to be at Wogan House, the home of BBC Radio 2 and Six Music, and we're talking to Jeremy Vine. Jeremy, thank you for talking to us on Talking Radio.
A great pleasure to meet a fellow radio person, James.
Now, we should say we're filming this just after 10 o'clock in the morning, so you are in already for your show. Talk me through how the day works for you.
Well, this morning I cycled in with a Boris bike, one of those hire
Yes.
bikes, and that's always a little bit iffy because you don't have your sort of bike horn and all of that stuff. But I got in about 8 o'clock. We then have a meeting. We discuss everything. We discuss stories that are in the news and then stories that we've just seen knocking around. I wanted to do a piece about, is your husband always watching history channels, and particularly about the Second World War? I don't know why, because I just thought it's a great story to do. We're not doing that, though. We decide what the stories are, and the team then start to make the calls, and I have a nice little hour and a half to speak to you.
And the stories and the questions you ask are legendary. I remember our first ever Talking Radio, we were speaking to Emma Britton, who's the breakfast presenter at Radio Bristol.
Oh, I love her,
She said she remembered the time you asked, and it's the classic, and you mentioned it in your new book, have your eyes ever been pecked out by a gannet?
Yes.
I think my favourite is the one about confusing your eyelid drops with super glue and gluing your eyes shut.
Oh, dear.
They're always about eyes for some reason.
Yeah, a lot of eyes, a lot of animals. Have you ever been attacked by a goose? Have you ever been attacked by a seagull? Have you ridden a miniature Shetland pony? Has your house ever been set on fire by a paperweight left on the window? So lots of people have.
Yes.
And I suppose my thought about Radio 2 now, and the joy of having done this show for nearly 15 years, is that the listeners they may not have expertise. They're not professors, but they have experience. And there's something very valuable in this world about first-person experience.
Do you still learn things from your listeners? Because you've been doing the show almost 15 years now. Did you learn it all at the beginning, or are you still learning insights about the British public now?
Learning all the time. They can surprise me with their opinions. For example, you would not think the Radio 2 audience would be very Labour-leaning. But when Jeremy Corbyn comes in, there's something about the whole Corbyn thing they really respond to. And I think even if they don't agree with his policies, I think he's very authentic, Corbyn, and he sort of doesn't ever dodge a question. And they feel he's speaking the truth. And you realise that old school politician thing of people in suits trying to avoid questions, if people are so fed up with now. So yeah, we're always learning all the time. We did an item just last Friday about scattering ashes. And were they being scattered in the wrong places? Because somebody, I think, had somehow, her dog had gone through some in a park. Again, there's an animal. And we got some amazing stories of the family picnic that had been ruined when two elderly people had scattered ashes nearby, and the wind had blown the ashes across the children and the sandwiches. And this mum just added that the sandwiches were Marks and Spencer's finest. And I thought, that's the detail that makes it,
Is there ever a question you've wanted to ask and you've pitched it in the meeting, or someone's pitched it in the meeting and you've just thought, even for us, we can't ask that?
Probably all the time. I mean, I think when it goes wrong is when if I get a bit cross or a bit, into a story. I mean, we had a Southern Rail guy on, and obviously Southern Rail have been absolutely disastrous recently. All their trains have been cancelled. And it hasn't affected me personally, but I know about the anger. And they came on to say, we're going to start doing things better. And the very first thing the spokesman said was good morning. And I said, well, that's brilliant, isn't it? Because it's not even morning, it's afternoon. And if you don't even know the difference, how on earth can you run a train service? And I sort of went off on one. I thought, no, that's probably not very professional,
We have your new book, Jeremy Vine, What I Learned, What My Listeners Say, and Why We Should Take Notice here. Very good read. We'll put the link to it in the description, because it is, for any person who loves radio, it's a brilliant read. In your first book, you talk a bit more about when you took over at Radio 2 and taking over from Jimmy Young, and I know that was quite awkward. I think you said you'd never properly had a conversation with him about it. Did you ever? Because obviously he's no longer with us. No,
he's died recently. I never met him. I would have liked to have done. I think the thing for Jimmy, and I sort of understand it from his side a bit more now, having been here longer, that even at the age of 82, he didn't want to go, and they were going to lever him out. And that's a very painful process for a radio station, because the listeners all side with the presenter. And then I'm sort of given the job, and I'm 37 years younger than him. I mean, that's more than a generational change. And I think it was very there was also kind of a snafu over who'd been offered it and stuff. And it was all just untidy. And I think for the listeners, the great thing about radio, I think TV is all about novelty and radio is all about consistency. TV is all about impact. Radio is all about a conversation. And, with TV you announce things, and with radio you share them. And I think, therefore, Jimmy was a really big part of a lot of people's lives, a lot of older listeners. He was like the armchair in the front room. And suddenly the builders come and they say, well, we're sorry, we put it in the skip. And that was really traumatic. I think I didn't realise at the time just how traumatic. And traumatic for Jimmy as well, who lived for another, 15 years and probably somewhat regretted the manner of his departure.
Moving away from your show at the moment to sort of broader radio, if I can, I know your radio hero is Kenny Everett.
Totally.
And you were introduced by Kenny Everett when you did that thing on Capital Radio when you were younger.
Yeah, so Capital Radio in London had a kind of a little young DJ slot, and he basically did the jingle introducing it. But he was in the station when I went to record it, and I caught a glimpse of him, which was an amazing thing for me because he was totally my radio hero. Now he died probably even before you were born, but his ability, you could look it all up, the way he used radio, it's almost like you're hearing a cartoon. It was that exciting. I think at his peak time, he was just doing one show a week that was so produced. He probably spent 5 days on it. Just for the sheer love. And the saddest thing is that if he hadn't died of AIDS when he did, I think he'd be on this station now, and I'd see him in the lift, and I'd say, "You were my hero, and you inspired me." I was going to say that in the terms of the top 5, I always think it's Kenny number 1, then John Peel, both sadly gone, then Terry. Also not with us, and probably then the person who uses this studio, Steve Wright, or the one who uses the other studio, Chris Evans. And I brought a friend round Radio 2 about 10 years ago, and he met Terry, Steve, and Chris in the same half hour. And I said, that's of the 3 still alive, you've met all of them.
And I don't think I can pick fault with that at all. I mean, you hear every now and then you get lists of whatever, and normally I'm not a fan of lists, but when I read in your book you mentioned that top 5, I thought, I can't argue with that.
Well, I think everyone's is different, and I actually, funny enough, just behind me here is Ken Bruce's studio, and now Ken is a really interesting one because I don't put him in my top 5, but then I look at it and I think I don't know why not, because in terms of actual longevity, he may beat all of them in terms of the sheer number of hours of broadcasting. The fact that he's got this show from 9:30 till 12, which posts the most amazing audience figures on Radio 2. The listeners love him and the show. He's actually, rather like Wogan, much more subversive. He's never bland. He's a very intelligent man. He always outsmarts me every day when I go and trail my show. So I think I'm close to having to put him in the top 5, but he'll be mortified if I ever do that.
Outside of Radio 2, which other stations do you listen to?
I've been getting into that Frank Skinner show on Absolute.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed that. If I'm around the country, I love to listen to BBC Local Radio. A few years recently, I've been a judge in what's called the Frank Gillard Awards, which is a sort of, I think for local radio stations, it's presenters. So I've just been able to listen to loads and loads of different presenters, and it's really interesting how you'll get. There was a woman on Coventry, I think, who was just amazing. I won't say her name is too. Go on.
Trisha Doody?
Yes, it was. Yeah, absolutely amazing. Then there are one or two who are, in a way, I wouldn't say they're poor, but they're more derivative. So there was somebody somewhere who sounds exactly like Steve Wright, and I thought, the key thing is to be yourself.
Be yourself, yeah.
And it really, I listened to it with great interest, these tapes. It's maybe about 15 to 20 shows that are given to us, and we listen to about, an hour of each. And I'm going around cycling with listening on holiday. And my wife says, "What are you doing?" He's really immersed. I said, "It's fascinating, because it's who's real."
Yeah.
And Trish is a good example. I feel like I know who Trish is because I've heard her on the radio.
When you started, did you find yourself subconsciously not mimicking someone, but picking up things? Did you go, "Hang on, I sound a bit like them" or something?
It's really difficult. I think the biggest problem for me in my career was when I was on Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman, because Paxman was the absolute template for interviewing. And also because I was called Jeremy as well. So I had to, and I was young, I was kind of 34, 35, so I was filling in all the shifts he couldn't do. I mean, sometimes I did maybe 13, 14 shifts in a row. I think I had at one point I did basically every shift on Newsnight for 3 weeks on the trot, because Kirsty was away and Jeremy had a hacking cough. So there was an awful lot of air miles there as a presenter, which was good. But I could never work out, am I supposed to be like Paxman, or am I supposed to be different from him? And I was really trapped, because if I did really soft interviews, they said, "Oh, well, of course, if Paxman had been in there, it wouldn't have been the same." If I did really hard interviews, then they just said, "Oh, he's just impersonating Paxman." So Radio 2 sort of airlifted me out of that situation, for which I'll always be grateful. But that just made me think it's really hard. You have to be your own real self. And there's something about taking over from Sir Jimmy, because he was so much of a different generation. You know, he'd been a pop star in the 1950s. It's possible to start with a completely clean sheet and sort of work out who you are.
I suppose Chris Evans had that when he took over from Wogan. Completely different style of broadcast.
Yeah, although Chris had done more. He'd done more radio,
yeah,
music
of course,
radio than me.
yeah.
So he'd done the Radio 1 breakfast show, and he'd done much more sort of personal, what you might call personality-led presenting on Channel 4. Anyway. So he definitely knew who he was.
Yeah.
That's true.
He had an established brand,
although he did certainly, I think all of us hitting middle age become different people, and I think Chris worked out, because we had a bit of a scandal here with the so-called Ross brand and everything, which is all water under the bridge now. But I think Chris looked at that from a distance and thought, okay, doing the bad boy thing doesn't really work anymore. You have to be family friendly on this network as a broadcaster. And he, I think, grew up through that experience and worked out how he needed to sound and who he needed to be. He doesn't broadcast in this studio. He's in my studio. So it goes Chris over there, Ken there, me over there, Steve right there, Simon Mayer over there. We've got 3 studios. We probably only need 2, actually.
Now, to this point in the interview that we allow producer Andy's on camera today to ask an off-mic question.
Oh, brilliant. This is good.
Andy, what's your question?
Well, because we're in Steve Wright's studio, do you mind, he plays little Jeremy Vine impressions.
I know what you're going to say.
And I think Ian Duncan Smith covered your show about a month or 2 ago.
Yeah.
And he had John Coltrane on. They were doing your impression as well.
Yeah.
Do you mind the Jeremy Vine impressions every afternoon between 2 and 5?
Steve is such a lovely man that he actually asked me that question himself. He said, I'm just checking. You don't mind that? I said, I don't want to say I love it, because it makes it sound like I'm forcing him to play it. But this genius Lewis MacLeod from Dead Ringers. Yeah. And Lewis, he's completely got me. So much so that when Steve plays these jingles with Lewis MacLeod impersonating me, people then message and say, "Why haven't you gone home yet?" So no, of course I don't mind. It's brilliant, and it's actually a subtle way of, I think, cross promotion on the on the station in a way.
I'm making it sound like one station. It's all linked up.
Exactly.
There's not one show next to another.
When I used to listen to Capital Radio as a really young teenager, and they had these great DJs, Roger Scott and Nicky Horn and Graham Dean and Dave Cash and all of that, and I mean, it was absolutely the number 1 station in London. It was an amazingly powerful brand, and I noticed that when other DJs talked about Bruce Springsteen, they would always say Bruce, because Roger Scott used to talk like that, and he would say Bruce like that. So it was, and he was obsessed with Springsteen. So it was I always thought that's a really subtle bit of linking up shows across the network. You don't even notice it.
Moving on to some sort of things looking ahead in the radio industry. Obviously, Radio 1 and 2 have just celebrated their 50th anniversary. It's funny, in that time, they've slightly switched roles almost, because there was a time when Radio 1 was kind of the nation's station and your mum could listen to it and you could listen to it and whatever. And now it seems like Radio 2 has become, well, it has in terms of listening figures, the big station, with Radio 1 more youth-focused. In 50 years' time, A, do you think Radio 2 will still be going strong, and B, do you think it'll have the same role in the marketplace?
Impossible to answer that, really, because 50 years, who knows. But one thing that I'm amazed by is that radio, which is such an old-fashioned medium, unlike TV, which is much more newfangled, has survived the first internet avalanche. I mean, it is amazing partly because we're called the wireless, and now wireless means something else, But how has it happened? It's worth us really just having a moment and thinking. And I think the answer is, I've got my phone somewhere. If I want to, let's say I want to listen to Elvis Costello Allison. Let's just see how many clicks it is on Spotify, right? So that's 1 click to turn my phone on. Then I kill my emails. That's 2 clicks. 3 clicks, I go to my music folder there.
Yeah.
4 is Spotify. Come on. It's loading. And then, it's still, look at that, it's still loading there.
It's a good case in point about BBC Wi-Fi.
Yeah, you see, well, it's probably the app, actually. And I'm just going to go, so this is now 5 clicks, and I'm going to type in, anyway, you see the point?
Yeah.
It's going to take me a while. Radio, 1 touch. 1 touch and I got Radio 2. And the great thing is they're going to choose the music for me. And as long as I'm in this trusted relationship with the Radio 2 presenters, with Ken or Steve or whatever, I know they're not going to play me a bad record. And I think Radio 2 at some point realised there are 500 great records and we're just going to play them all the time. So that's the secret. It's not really a secret. With Radio 1, I I have no criticism of them at all. They're doing something much more difficult, which is that they're trying to build and hold an audience that's about 15, 16 years old, who have got an absolute plethora of internet, 3G, 4G going on in their lives. They are living a digital life. So wireless is a bit old-fashioned. We've happily got lots of pensioners listening. We need to get 35-year-olds listening. That's a challenge for us. If we do, we will be here in 50 years' time.
Radio 1 have been very big on the whole social media thing, and their YouTube channel was very successful. And Radio 2 have kind of upped their game at that. There are kind of two schools of thought on social media and radio. Some people say, particularly for a station like Radio 2 that's maybe got a slightly older audience than Radio 1, we don't have to, why are we focusing on it so much? And other people say, no, we've got to be across it. Do you fall into either of those camps?
I think we're a little bit in a cleft stick on social media. We have quite a corporate approach to social media on Radio 2, in that the station will tell you things about what it's doing, which is very old-fashioned. The ideal is to share and hear back. Now, the question is then whether you unleash the presenters' Twitter accounts in support of the station. But for various reasons, that the presenters' Twitter accounts are regarded as private, and there are good reasons for that, because actually, there was a presenter, I think, on another station whose Twitter account was part of the station's internet offer, and then she launched a range of underwear on it, and I think that's quite, so that really troubles the BBC. We don't really know how to do social media yet, I don't think. I think Radio 2's social media is for better or worse, it's much more you go to our website and you watch our concerts. And I think it could do with being a bit less formal. But I think that also creates other problems. To give you an example of how complex this is, when I was on Crime Watch last, they asked me to Facebook Live something, and I said, okay, give me your account password. And they said, no, from your own account. So I was Facebook Living some item about paedophiles from my own account, which has got, family holidays on. I thought, we haven't quite worked it out yet. It's difficult. And I think, we know that there are digital immigrants. That's me. I have gone into the digital world from outside. And there are digital natives like you. You were born into it. You've never known anything else. And we've got to bridge them. I think the social media side is fascinating. I don't really know what the solution is. I always come back to the radio, one touch.
And just finally, I mentioned earlier you've almost done 15 years now on your show, because it was January 2003.
Yes, it was. You're great.
Yeah. Another 15 years? Do you want to be doing it?
At least, 100. No, I mean, this is the best show. This is the best job in the BBC, and I can say that with conviction because I've done lots of them. I've presented Newsnight. I've been Africa correspondent. That comes pretty close, actually. Political correspondent, Today programme reporter, Crime Watch, Panorama, etc. Even Strictly. But this is, if Strictly was a full-time job, then it might come close. But it's a joyful thing, James. I mean, it is, because in the end, people say, well, what do you want to do next? And I think what I want to do next is go in to Radio 2. They give me a big canvas and a paintbrush and a paint pot, and they tell me to paint something. Now, I don't know how you can improve on that. So, we're very, very lucky because we have got a very big audience, and for journalism that's great because you can throw out a big dragnet. You can say, have you ever been pecked in the eye by a gannet? And someone has been.
Jeremy Vine's new book, What I Learned, What My Listeners Say and Why We Should Take Notice, is out now. We'll put the details in the description. Jeremy, thank you so much for talking to us on Talking Radio.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking Radio.